time. And Victoria Ellington. Hello, Victoria. How nice. All sorts of wonderful, familiar faces. Is that we spent about the first 30 minutes with me going through some questions that we have developed as a team, and also fielding some questions that have been given to us by some of you in advance. And then for the last half, we open it up to the floor, so to speak, for people to raise their individual questions, having seen the video from American Opera Projects in Brooklyn, and to get some further insights, because of course, good questions come from everywhere. So full disclosure, Inkiru and Jonathan and Jane and I had an early meeting last week, and we learned all sorts of wonderful things about the opera, its gestation, its early incarnation, and so we've had a bit of a sneak preview. But I would like to ask you, Inkiru, if you wouldn't mind starting. We've had on this program so far someone who has acted in a production capacity, namely our own Glenn Plott, who took us through a wonderful production of Guido's Mephistopheles that we watched. We had creators, meaning performer creators, from the wonderful opera in Philadelphia, We Shall Not Be Moved, original cast members. We've had a session with the amazing director, Barry Kosky, talking about his production of Eugene Onegin in Berlin. But this is the first time we get to speak to a composer. So we're really, really excited because Cincinnati Opera, in addition to honoring the classics and the core repertoire, is all about creating new music, of course, especially in these last 20 years. And so it's lovely always to have a living, breathing, talking composer in our midst. So, Inkiru, would you share with our group again just how Harriet Tubman, When I Crossed That Line to Freedom, came to be? Because you started out life as a composer of instrumental and choral music, and as you told us, opera sort of crept up on you by accident.
It did. But I want to, I was actually completely in symphonic and instrumental world. So I was at a school that had this enormous chorus and no orchestra. And they were, write us some music, write music for the choir. And I was thinking, but I don't write choral music. And so I was going to do this piece on a Black woman and narrowed it down to Harriet Tubman. And I was going to write this oratorio, and an oratorio is a, just trying to think of how to say it without the,
the hierarchy. Everybody think of Messiah, right? I mean, there is a narrative, but it's a little bit more abstract. There's not as much drama. It's true.
Right. And it's not really acted out. So I was thinking to do that with a whole bunch of spirituals and just intersperse it, connect it with Harriet Tubman quotes. And it was such a great idea that someone else had done it. So, so I'm there holding the score of this piece that I would have written and said, well, wait a minute, I still want to do something on Tubman. And I was thinking, all right, let me find out what her motivation was for going up and down the Northeast corridor, because there's this whole thing, it's kind of this gender thing about men will talk about women and they'll say, oh, she did that and it's crazy. So it's, and especially as a woman in a man's field, and at the time I had, male composition students, they're saying, well, my girlfriend's crazy, my mother's crazy. Well, what did you do to her? And so this idea that, here's this woman who did something that really is something that's eyebrow raising. She goes up and down the Northeast corridor. So I want to know why. And so it just started with that.
And you developed it using all of your best scholarly resources. And I would love for you, if you have that book in the room with you, to share with us your primary research tool, which still has about 100 Post-its in it, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, the first book that I took out, this is the only one that was available at that time, was the Sarah Bradford book, and this is The Moses of Her People, you know, Harriet Tubman, The Moses of Her People. So this book has Tubman quotes, and you can see, if you can look really carefully, you'll see where I highlighted these passages. And these are quotes from Harriet Tubman that I liked them so much. I said, okay, here's my text. And some of this book, I have to say, is truly horrific. This is a woman who was on Tubman's side, you know, and I'm just going to read to you some of the parts of this that were very difficult for me to read, because if you look at this in its context, again, it's horrific, but these are the people who was on Tubman's side. And this is written when Tubman is she's probably in her 90s, and she's in Auburn, New York, where she's retired, and she's living in an old folks home that bears her name. And so this is just the first chapter. It says, Harriet, the Moses of her people. On a hot summer's day, perhaps 60 years ago, a group of merry little darkies were rolling and tumbling in the sand in front of a large house on a southern planter. Their shining skins gleamed in the sun as they rolled over each other in their play, and their voices, as they chattered together or shouted in glee, reached even to the cabins of the Negro quarter, where the old people groaned in spirit as they thought of the future of those unconscious young revelers. And their cry went up, "Oh Lord, how long?" Apart from the, so that's already kind of vomitous type of material, but let's continue just a little bit. Apart from the rest of the children, on the top rail of a fence, holding tight to the tall gate post, sat a little girl of perhaps 13 years of age, darker than any of the others, and with a more decided woolliness in the hair, a pure, unmitigated African. And so it goes, it goes on like that. This is so incredibly offensive, right? So, yeah. So fortunately, you know, as I'm reading this book and I'm just going through it and looking at it as a historical source, and it's really, really difficult to parse this language, you know, with modern sensibility. But I think this is what we have to do as the modern historian, not changing history, but putting it in context. And like I said, at that time, that was the only source. Now, what I did not know is that, and what I did find out, is that there was a graduate student, a doctoral student, who was about to publish a book on Tubman. And Kate Larson, I know you're here somewhere. I see you. Kate Clifford Larson, raise your hand. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because Kate's book, which she sent to me pre-publication, because there's this kind of sisterhood that we found, you know, in people who are looking at Tubman. And Kate wrote her book, Bound for the Promised Land. So this is the much easier book to read, and it's much more comprehensive. And I think that both of them are really important, you know, in terms of looking at, you know, getting a picture of Tubman's life. Now, once we go past that, there's all this research that I did to put Tubman's life and her world in context. So.
Well, and one of the things that I found remarkable, and I think I want to turn the floor over to Jonathan in just a minute, is that you are an eclectic composer by admission and by your work, and all music is available to you. It's like to any 21st century composer, but you make very conscious choices during the course of the opera to trace and to make some continuities in terms of style when you actually have this kind of dramatic situation or that kind of dramatic situation. And I'd love for you to spare us a moment to talk a little bit about how you make choices musically for any particular situation. Is there, I mean, let me take one example and steer me off it if I'm wrong.
Okay.
in one of the very first choral numbers, and in a couple of the choral numbers in
Mhm.
the slave quarter, the
Mm.
slave population sings a hymn, and it's very Episcopalian sounding.
Ah,
Um,
God bless the Sabbath.
God bless the Sabbath. And
Yeah.
I thinking, so is this intentional? Is this Inkiru
Mm,
saying, because those of us who've done some reading on this subject, that there was this
mm,
whole movement among slave owners to quote, bring Jesus to the slave population. And to do so, they had to sing in the way that the masters, as it were, sang. And so
mhm,
when they are singing amongst themselves for this, it's very
mm.
Episcopalian. But when there's no one else around, it's a very different kind of music. And I'm wondering if that's a conscious choice on your part, or was it a storytelling activity? I loved it, and I thought it was very, very powerful.
Well, first, thank you. And it's all three, but most of all, it's historically accurate.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. Now, there's parts inside this book, and I'm going back to Sarah Bradford's book, and they talk about hymns, and they actually talk about the Methodist hymns that Harriet and whoever that knew. Yeah, so it actually talks about them, and one of them says, "Hail, O hail, ye happy spirits! Death no more shall make you fear. Grief nor sorrow, pain nor anguish shall no more distress you there." And so these are hymns. And so I just set either, I'm trying to think of that particular, well, God bless the Sabbath. I wrote that text.
Mhm.
And it does reflect the irony of here we are and we're being taught to do this. And it also tells people what they can do with themselves.
Wow, very powerful. Now, as you told us before, here you are, a neophyte in Operaland, and you basically teach yourself how to be a librettist and a dramaturg. Share with us a little bit of how that journey came about.
Well, Harriet Tubman is an amazing conductor. And I know this because she motivated me to write this and to undertake this.
Right.
And I studied. I went back. There were courses that I could have taken while I was at the conservatory and didn't take on opera.
Oh, Jonathan, close your ears.
Just before Jonathan was on faculty, but I was classes I could have taken, and I just
Right.
had no want to, just no desire to look at it. I couldn't ever see myself writing an opera. So I'm now thinking, oh man, I should have taken some of those courses. So I then have to go back and teach myself. But the neat thing about studying things when you're an adult is that you pay more attention. So I've read books on how to write there wasn't a book on how to write a libretto, but there was one on something about writing a musical, and there was playwriting, and so there were all these different sources that I looked up. And so I learned, here's playwriting, this is what you do. And then after the playwriting comes, okay, how do I make it into a libretto? And, at the time, at the early stages of it, I was still thinking of it more as a hybrid between opera and oratorio because of the big choral numbers.
Mhm.
And I still have to say that American Opera Projects, which is now the American Opera Projects, in the end, they're the ones who came by and said, okay, do some trimming here. I had the basic structure, I had most of it,
Mhm.
but they helped to workshop it and really gave me some, they brought in a dramaturg, they brought in people to help with some of this. So the structure of what I wanted to say was there, and it needed some trimming. So they helped to trim it.
And as you say, you're an Oberlin grad, a grad of the conservatory, and that's where,
Mhm.
Jonathan, you come in. How did the Harriet Tubman Opera come to Oberlin?
It's rather an interesting story. And Kiru got in touch with one of her old teachers, whose name was A.G. Miller, and said, I've got this opera. And A.G. Miller said, well, why don't you send it to the opera department? Because they're always doing new pieces there. And so the score comes across my desk, and I take a look at it and say, oh my gosh, we have to do this. And we have to do this as soon as possible because the student body changes, but we had the perfect cast available. We had Victoria Ellington, we had Amber Monroe. I mean, these were students of exceptional talent. And if I didn't do it within the next year or so, they would all be gone and I would never get a chance to do it again, or at least not that well. So it was actually through her old teacher that the piece came to me.
Wow. And I should add as a parenthetical that yes, they both left you and they both came to CCM because Victoria Ellington and Amber Monroe have been part of CCM and have already begun working with Cincinnati Opera. So yes, thank you for giving them the launching pad to come to yet another wonderful conservatory.
Yes, they're really, really wonderful.
We're glad to see you today, Victoria. So Jonathan, what was the process of creating the opera at Oberlin? Did you follow sort of a normal rehearsal path? Did you have more time? Did you and Kiru make changes as you were producing it? How did it work?
Well, I think one of the changes that I had to make is that we had to do a condensed version because when I saw the piece, the whole piece actually is much, much larger and calls for a larger orchestra. And so what I had to do is that I had to assemble together a small ensemble. One of our associate deans, Chris Jenkins, was really very, very helpful in this. And the other thing that I realized is that it was a work of faith, both from composer and main character. And so I thought that the best place to present it would be in houses of worship across Northeast Ohio. So I began to contact and research these various churches to see which ones had really, really strong music programs, and then went out and made associations with them, attended services, got to know them, and eventually scheduled the opera in these places. And the idea was that by touring it, we would actually be able to develop stronger performers, because I know when I've done touring work for San Francisco and Seattle, the performers always came back much, much better. So that was my hope, is to also create not only a community tie, but also stronger students.
Victoria, in the Oberlin production, what role did you play? Were you Harriet? Were you Rachel? What was your role?
I sang the role of Rachel, and Amber Monroe sang the role of Harriet.
Wonderful. What was it like creating that role? A very sympathetic role. This is the sister who stays behind and hews to the family and dies tragically, of course.
Yeah, I think Rachel has some of the really fun songs within the opera. And so her first one is I Want a Man, which is this jazz ballad type of an aria, which is just, it's whimsical and lighthearted, and she's just singing about how she wants to grow old and have babies and just be settled down with a husband, which is something that I think a lot of young girls relate to. And I think just the bond that Rachel has with her sister, Harriet, is just, it's special. And getting to perform that with Amber Monroe, who was one of my best friends, was a really fun and rewarding process to have been a part of, just to sort of create that sisterhood of Black women in opera, two sopranos singing, and we're not dueling about something, but we're sharing in love.
You're not Queen Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots. You actually get along.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Ernest, could I ask the same question of you, because you were in the American Opera Project's production and you sing two roles, both as a member of the slave community and also as the abolitionist leader. What was it like creating these new roles? Oh, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just did that. It actually was a great opportunity. One thing I loved about the role was that it was a role that sat in my sweet spot. So for me, it was written well because I got to show off the lower part of my voice and the upper part of my voice. It was always great because it was an opportunity to do something new and fresh that had not been performed. And it was a little hard because I had to play two different roles and there were two different personalities. One was a reverend, of course, which there is strength in that, but there was also a character where I was an abolitionist. And so there had to be another type of strength. So it was great creating two different roles. I would love to do it, of course, again. It was just overall fun. And how we came together in 3 weeks to make the show work was amazing. The amount of talent in the production, and there was just a level of everyone wanted to make the show a success. And that's what I really took away from it. It was just a great opportunity. It was truly a great opportunity.
Hey, Kiru, if you could reflect on the American Opera Project's production for us for just a moment, because you had as your director someone who became extremely dear to Cincinnati Opera. When we first produced Porgy and Bess in 2012, we were told about this exciting and gifted young director by the name of Lemuel Wade, who came to us and gave us the Porgy and Bess of our dreams. That we had never done the opera before, and we were sort of babes in the woods with this complex grand opera, and he guided it with such a sure hand. And of course, sadly, he left us all too early. But I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on what it was like with working with Lemuel to create the American Opera Project's production.
Well, Lem was just fantastic. In a lot of ways, he was a creative soulmate. You know, he'd heard about this opera. We had someone else attached to it as a director, and the other director pulled out sort of at the last minute, but not that much of a last minute, but enough to cause alarm. But Lem really, really wanted to do this, and it was just such a great fit. You know, he was known for directing Porgy and Bess, and he loved that this was a piece about a Black figure, but that it was written by an African American. And you know, he just loved being able to be creative with it. But I think one of the funniest things with this whole thing, you know, he saw a lot of humor in this. He calls me up and he says, "Hey, it's Lem. All right, so we're doing this. So I have this idea, and we don't have any money." And I was like, "Oh, okay, whatever this concept is going to be, I'm scared." So he had this whole vision about a train, and that everyone would be lined up like a train, and then at the end you'd see the train coming towards you. And I'm just listening, and I'm just kind of partially listening, because it makes no difference, because we are, I think, like 2 months away from the show, and regardless of what it is that has to happen, I'm going to have to go with his best guess. I'm like, okay, all right. But then you see the train concept, you know, and it worked. You know, he saw it, and he'd obviously been thinking about this for some time. And so, you know, God bless Lem. Yeah.
Well, it was an arresting visual image that was used to great strength, because they were a train, they were parishioners in a church, they were people ready for a meeting, and the conscious, not vagueness, but conscious utility of that image was very, very powerful.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about Porgy and Bess, and comparisons are odious, but I do note that you actually used the same phrase that Gershwin used, a folk opera. And I'm wondering, on the advertisement, and I'm wondering if that was conscious, or if that was something that how did it come about? I'm just curious.
Well, wow, that was such a long time ago, and I was not prepared for that question. So, I think one of the things is that it's so based on folk melodies, and in that sense, it's a folk opera. But the same could be said about Susanna, which most people don't know, but it's also based on folk material. But I'm kind of split about that at this time. if you tell some people that we're going to do an opera, they immediately shut down. And they shut down because the idea of opera is that it's elitist. But if you say, well, it's not really an opera, it's a folk opera, people just
doesn't it, a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah.
Takes
Yes.
maybe the anxiety level down a little bit.
Right. I'm also getting a point here from Naomi Andre. Hi, Naomi. She's saying that Black people
I
are.
also noticed that, who else did I see? That Kearstin Piper Brown was with us as well. This is a reunion. This isn't a. Hi, Kearstin. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
So, she's reminding me that Black people are folk, and she's pointing out Du Bois, the souls of Black folk. So that's another, that's a further, I don't want to say forgotten about that, but that's another, it's another dimension of it.
Well, one of the things too that strikes me about having the compositional palette that you can bring to your work is that you range over a wide field of compositional styles. And it seems with uncanny consistency, for a particular dramatic moment or for a particular character, you choose something that sounds a little bit more like this or a little bit more like that. And I'm wondering how is it you decide to, as it were, deploy your arsenal of styles moment to moment in the creation of a piece like this? Because there's blues, there's clapping dances, there's, as we said, the conscious imitation of Methodist hymns. There's a whole range of styles. It must be lots of fun, for one thing.
Oh, it is. Well, in some ways it's fun. In other ways, it's also very challenging because you don't want the music to sound like, you don't want it to sound like I've just gone through a whole bunch of styles. You want there to be cohesion. Now, in this case, I actually did go through a bunch of styles. See, there's this other book, which is also—
That's the one I wanted to see with all the posters.
So, I was teaching at the time, and I was teaching a book on, I was teaching a class on Black music. And there's this book, the Music of Black Americans. And there was a different edition that I was working out of at the time, but wait a minute. I went through the table of contents. You can look and see the contents here, and actually are probably in reflection, but I went through here and I just basically checked off. I used it as a checklist because I wanted to incorporate all of these styles. And in order to do that, I then had to do my own musicological and ethnomusicological research. So I got some books. So there is Harold Corlander, Negro Folk Music, USA. There's Slave Songs of the United States. There's this one. There's American Negro Songs. It's got folk songs and spirituals. And the other one, which I didn't bring from my library, but that's the shoot, what is that? That's the—
Is that the Sound of Slavery? The James, the Shane and Graham White book, the Sounds of Slavery book, because that's on your reading list.
Right. That's actually not in the musicological part, but that is how some of the it was strategic for some of the other things. I'm talking about the books of American Negro spirituals by the Johnson brothers, James Weldon Johnson and J. Rosamond Johnson.
Wow.
So going through all of those, it gives you the sound of various types of Black music. So then going through them, studying them, you're able to, it gives you an arsenal of styles. And as you're going through the different styles, you're able to see, okay, this happens here, this happens here. But also there's the whole idea of leitmotif, which is very operatic. And, Wagner uses these leitmotifs, and we certainly see it with, I think the most famous ones are in Star Wars or Jaws, and you think of, okay, we're about to have some scary music, and you hear this thing coming, right? Right. So, it's that type of thing that happens.
Well, something that strikes me, having listened and seen the opera now, is that in some ways, the opera, as you say, Harriet Tubman took a hold of you as a conductor. And the
Yes, she
opera is not just a dramaturgical expression of a heroine's life, but it's
did.
an act of homage in so many ways, stylistically, dramaturgically, historically, and the fact that you are bringing to life on the operatic stage an iconic figure in American history. It's a tricky thing. Did you ever find yourself in the compositional process saying, oh, me, have I bitten off more than I can chew? This is Harriet Tubman. This is not the lady down the street who sat on her porch all day.
Mhm.
Was it ever a challenge to you? Like, oh my gosh, I've got a tiger by the tail.
I don't think so, not in the way that you're talking about. Because, well, you do a doctoral thesis and it's kind of like, all right, it's just, it's just research.
Yeah.
And it kind of, at that point, it doesn't make any difference what the topic is. You're researching the topic. But, for me, there was so much more. I found a lot of things about myself, about my African American heritage. I'm half Nigerian, but I was raised in the U.S. and I'm half African American. So there's a lot of this music that is my birthright. And these stories, going through slave narratives and newspaper articles from that day and all of the research that I did, it was for me. And all of the things that you learn in the conservatory, close your ears, Jonathan, all of these things are, these are things that made me feel uncomfortable in the conservatory. And if you think about it, we had, at that year, I think we had 2,900 students in the conservatory. So we were beyond max capacity. Of that, there were 25 African-American students. There weren't any other in composition, and the less said about composers and the gender gap, the better. And so there's a lot of weeding out that happens there, and there's a lot of isolation that happens. And so, I had another major in African American studies, and this was kind of an extension of it for me, and it helped me to retain myself.
It keeps coming back to me, and I'd love to ask Naomi to join us. Naomi Andre, the author of Black Opera, who came to Cincinnati about a year ago and gave us a wonderful evening's opera wrap. We're so glad that you're with us today. I also have to say, this is like an old home week reunion because Laquita Mitchell is on with us. Hello, Laquita, who's been with us before. I have to go to the other screens to see who else has joined. But Naomi, I wonder if you'd spend a moment in putting this Harriet Tubman opera sort of in context of where we find ourselves today in the world of operatic expression by African-American composers. So Nkiru, close your ears because she's probably going to say something very complimentary. Naomi, please.
Well, my goodness, thank you. I'm so honored. I'm here just loving seeing everybody here. It is just terrific. And thank you so much for hosting this talk. I just wanted to jump on the bandwagon with this question of Harriet Tubman and such an important figure and how we have almost no operas about Black women, where they're called Black women. And here we have a Black woman composer, which is also super rare, writing an opera called Harriet Tubman. But in Nkiru, she always is putting lots of voices in there. And so I had the amazing opportunity. My last concert in a concert hall before the pandemic was at the Detroit Symphony Orchestra in March when Nkiru was here in Detroit as the composer in residence. They did a wonderful showing of her works, her other works, and they did a new piece, newly commissioned. And there was a work that had, it was operatic, but I don't think it was called, she's not calling it an opera, but beautiful. big orchestra and singers. And in there, she, you know, how in a lot of Black urban centers or even smaller towns, there are sort of the Black bottom section of which she named this, but she talked about this one woman who, and she said the name and had it in there, just sort of a regular person who she was writing into history. And Kara, do you want to mention that, just because you did such a beautiful job, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember her name, even though you say it again and again and again.
Oh, well, the name of the woman is Dr. Rosa Slade Gregg.
That's it. They spell it, they say it, Dr. Rosa Slade Gregg. And she's which is not a name that most people know about, even here in Detroit, although some people do. And she was just giving a wonderful tribute to not just, you know, Harriet Tubman in one work, but also just, you know, here's a piece for Detroit and we're getting to hear about it. And Kiru's voice is so important in opera today in general, but especially when we're thinking about operas about sort of subjects that we need to hear more about. And then I'll be quiet.
Well, also, I mean, the roll call just continues. I noticed that Adrienne Danrich has joined us. Thank you, Adrienne. Adrienne has, of course, been a part of the Cincinnati Opera family for almost as long as I've been with Cincinnati Opera. The author of This Little Light of Mine, a wonderful touring program about some of the African-American women pioneers in the world of opera. She also has another program about Langston Hughes, and Adrienne has been a wonderful participant. She's most recently been with us as part of the workshop of the new Tobias Picker opera, Awakenings, and of course will be back. And speaking of Porgy and Bess, of course, Adrienne was our first Serena and brought down the house every night in 2012 when we first did Porgy and Bess. So this is Old Home Week. I'd love to go back to you and Kiru, and I'd love to also get a couple of questions from the list that came up in the chat. And I'm wondering, someone wrote to us that someone just finished Hollywood on Netflix, which brought up that question. This is this series, this rather glossily produced Netflix series about Hollywood, particularly in the 1950s. And it has a very particular point of view, and it is mostly about, of course, aspiring young white actors, but fascinating. And the questioner says, do you wish you could write more about the African-American experience, and are there aspects of the African-American experience that you feel are underserved in the world of opera today? Don't mean to put you on the spot, but I mean, maybe opera, but fire away if you have a thought on it.
Well, yes and no. So I'll start with the no side because that's always easier. So on the no side, only telling stories about the African-American experience, which is it's immeasurably important, but only telling those stories. It's more about being only able to tell those stories because those are the stories that people are coming after me to do. I have this one Greek-themed opera. It's called We've Got Our Eye on You, and it's funny, it's over-the-top funny, and it's about sisterhood. And a lot of people don't do it because they figure if we're going to do a piece by a Black woman, it needs to be about a Black subject. And I'm just like, but wait, it's a fun piece. So there's that.
Well,
I also have
if it's about a Greek subject, we need to talk some more. Because no one can make it up out of My Big Fat Greek Wedding. So why not? Let's find another topic.
This was about the Greek gods, so we'll go back to that. Thank you.
Antiquity is okay. It's not off limits.
I also had one about a figure in classic literature. And it's like I couldn't sell it to anybody because people were just not seeing the connect. Now, anyone else who has a PhD and enjoys reading various type of literature, it's a no-brainer. But there's a Black woman writing it, so don't tell anybody. But the piece is about a figure who nobody knows is Black. So I'm gonna.
That's a great teaser. That is a great teaser.
Don't
Jonathan,
tell anybody.
Jonathan, if we could come back to you for just a moment before opening our last minutes to the floor for a few questions from our audience. You've had a deep experience with this opera. What kind of impression do you think it made on the students? Do you recall, after they went through this process of learning and performing this opera, some of the things they said to you, some of the discoveries they made about themselves as artists or as humans?
The reaction of the audience to the performance created this bond between the performers. We actually had brought in two professionals. We brought in David Huey from New York and Brian Johnson from Cleveland. The whole cast, in performing this and realizing how the audiences became transformed, the cast in and of themselves became transformed. I think also having to perform in a different venue every single performance made them aware of what the audience was doing and how to play the audience. And the interesting thing is that there were certain people in the orchestra and certain cast members who I would see in the hallways years afterwards, and we always had a connection. I mean, I didn't talk about it with them directly as to how they were changed, but everybody coming together and creating this piece, which is based primarily on faith and then presenting it to institutions of faith, really made a distinctive impression on the people who saw it and certainly on the performers themselves.
I also notice, again, I'm making it sound like a roll call, and I know I will miss someone, but that Amber is with us, Amber Monroe, who was also in the Oberlin cast, and of course is a distinguished member of the CCM cohort. Amber, welcome. We have, these things always go by too quickly, but I think we can open it up to the floor if you'd like. If there's someone who'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Ann Arenstein is always quickest off the mark. Go ahead, Ann. Unmute yourself, dear.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, Ms. Okoye, it's such a powerful opera, and I think that the two pieces, the two arias you wrote for Harriet are, I mean, they're so powerful and so, they should be showpieces for any celebration we have of freedom. I just felt like that's what we should be hearing on July the 4th or Juneteenth or any, they were so powerful. But I want to ask you about writing a libretto. You incorporated Harriet Tubman's words so beautifully and so powerfully. What was it like to get to work with your words and hers? What was the biggest challenge in incorporating your words into hers?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing was finding a way to do it that did not have my agenda in there. My agenda was to tell her story. I've heard other people do the same story, you know, Harriet's story, and they tell it with an agenda. They use slave dialect. There's a book that really surprised me in terms of the inaccuracies and whatever. And I mean, when I say that I went through these books and I highlighted everything that she supposedly said, I went even beyond the Sarah Bradford book into Kate's book, into there were two other biographies that had also come out, and I went through and I highlighted everything. And I also studied that time period, so that I also read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I noticed what the difference was between dialect and slave dialect and accent was. And I also read The Sounds of Slavery, which showed that there wasn't slave dialect. This was something that white people made up to justify enslaving African Americans. And so, armed with all of that information and looking at this, it's Victorian English. And so I tried to keep it as kind of folksy, but as much as I could do in that, with, you know, in her language and with her intent. So, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I notice also that we have two more members of the AOP cast who have joined us. Patrice Eaton, who sang the role of Caroline, and a great privileged to have Damien Norfleet with us, who sang the role of John Tubman. And Damien, would you be willing to turn on your camera and share with us a thought? I have a specific question, if you don't mind. Is that all right? And unmute yourself. You know, being the husband of a famous person is not easy in any generation and in any culture. And I think Nkiru gave you, as the character of John Tubman, some incredibly beautiful and powerful and very, very human sentiments, because there is the pride of a man as well as the deep love that he has for the woman whom he loves, and then from feeling somewhat betrayed because she leaves. I'm wondering if you talk just a little bit about the character and how you engaged with it. Damien, you need to unmute yourself if you wouldn't mind. Are you there still? I thought you were. Well, maybe he can't unmute himself. I see the name. Ah, okay. Well, Damien, while you're getting engaged, I would like to begin then turn it back to you, Nkiru, because in their little meeting duet, you engage with a very important topic that I've just become more aware of in recent years, this incredible documentary of 2011 called Dark Girls, about the whole color issue within the African-American community. And in addition to creating a beautiful narrative, you find time in the course of telling this story to touch on aspects of culture that you have weaved into the story, but also allow you to engage with topics. And I'm wondering if that was also conscious, or did it just come out of the narrative of her life?
No, it was, I guess it's both. But this is one thing that I can do as a Black woman that other people might not be aware of, is raise awareness of this color issue. And there's some other issues that are there also. But I was going to ask if everyone knows what he's talking about with that, but you know, it's Harriet, and I don't necessarily know that this was an issue between Harriet and John, but it's certainly an issue that would have come up, you know, in terms of once you're free, you know, why wouldn't you marry a lighter girl, a lighter woman? You know, with that, the lighter skin color comes privilege. With the lighter skin color comes access to certain things. People with lighter skin, a lot of them were so light that they actually passed for white. They would cover up their hair and they would pass for white. So these are things that it's called light-skinned privilege that happens. And as Harriet Tubman was envisioned to be something that's educational on a bunch of different levels, colorism just seemed to be, oh, well, this is natural. It's just a natural type of thing.
Well, it's beautifully woven into the story, and it makes also John a very sympathetic character.
Yeah.
Paula Ash, I know you had raised your hand to ask a question. Unmute yourself and ask it if you wouldn't mind now, Paula. Yes, take your mute off.
First, these Zooms are incredible. And the cast you have, the presenters, I Googled their bio, is remarkable. So sorry for my accent. And I wanted to say, the woman who mentioned the opera who was for a Black person, but nobody knew about it, was that Mrs. Okoye? I can't remember.
She's keeping it a secret for now until someone produces.
Well, we have a hero here, an icon in Cincinnati, who did pass for white. She was a beautiful Black woman. You know who she is? The inauguration of her statue was supposed to be last month. That's Marianne Spencer. And she opened a segregated Coney Island. And the judge said, "Why are you hanging with all these Black people?" And she said, "I'm sorry." And she succeeded in opening Coney Island. So that's for another opera.
She's a great hero in our culture, and she just passed, I think, at a great old age just last year, at the end of last year. We have time for one or two more questions from the floor. If someone wants to, as it were, metaphysically or raise their hand. I'm scrolling through the signals, and maybe, Matt, you can help me too to find if there's another person who has a question for us. Don't be bashful. This is your chance. Mr. Thompson, Richard Thompson, would you mind unmuting yourself? There we go. Please take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Evans. First of all, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to hear and meet Inkiro. Actually, Inkiro, if I can just say hi, because we've known of each other for years, and it's the first time we've actually met. And I don't actually have a question. I wanted just to piggyback onto one of the comments you made about Black subject matter. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I've spoken about and written about a few times. It's not really anything new, but I think it's just worth emphasizing this point that in our education, musical education in classical music, it's completely Eurocentric. And we're seeing now finally a spate of new operas that deal with African-American history. And I think it's really important that we have many of these operas, because there's a tendency in the media, in Hollywood, theater, etc., to limit the Black experience to one or two very limited categories. In fact, historically and in terms of our contemporary life, the Black experience encompasses so much more. So by telling stories of people of achievement, especially, it does educate a wider audience into the history of Black America. You've got that great book by Eileen Sutherland, which I read years ago. And actually, I've been in America for 34 years. I grew up in Britain. I actually grew up in Scotland. So when I came to America, I went through this huge, long process of acculturation. And I consider myself, rightfully or wrongfully, a lot better educated now. But I think it's really important that we show different aspects of what Black Americans have done, what they're doing now, and what they're capable of doing. When we look at, say, for example, apart from the world of opera, the world of Hollywood, you find over and over again these stereotypical characters. They are certainly grounded in truth, but there's so much more that needs to be told, so many more stories that need to be told.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Amila Henry, who is the Artistic Director of American Opera Projects, which presented the production that you saw when you previewed for this talk, is with us. And Mila, I would love for you to take the floor as we come to the close. We'll have time for one or two more questions maximum. But what was the experience for AOP in producing this opera? I realize now it's several years ago, but has the engagement with the Harriet Tubman Opera continued to resonate for the company?
Absolutely, and it's a pleasure to be here and to revisit this piece today and see so many familiar faces from the original production and those since. And yes, this is a production that's near and dear to our hearts. We were honored to collaborate with Inkiro and to take it on, and it's one that we certainly would love to keep going in the future. And we recently made a video which brought together many of the original cast and cast members since from a canceled production in the spring, and it was it's a message that we all need to keep on going, and a voice that definitely needs to continue to be heard. So we're really happy to be helping bring that message forward.
Well, and you know that Cincinnati Opera is a great fan of AOP, and we will
likewise.
We look forward to ways to collaborate, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
I know Joelle Lamar has a question as we're reaching to the end. Joelle, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I literally just asked it privately. How did you choose what parts of her life to highlight and what parts not to? Because, you know, there was the whole bit of her, not bit, but her life and a part in her life where she, you know, took a bunch of people on a boat, crossed them over. She was a spy. Like, how did you choose what parts to focus on?
The question for every dramatist. In Kiro, yeah, I mean, writing an opera is as much about what not to include as it is to include, especially for an iconic figure. What was your process?
Well, since since my story was mainly on what made Harriet Tubman, I had to go through her childhood, but then also the whole thing was about the sisterhood, and so anything that didn't have to do with either there are certain plot points that you have to have in. So I went through the specific plot points that were really important. And then after that, everything else becomes other. And it's really, really hard to say, okay, this is really important to her. And, finally it's the producers, AOP's like, yes, we absolutely love this, and you're absolutely right, it has to go. And so there was another section with Thomas Garrett, the Quaker, and we're like, yes, we absolutely love this, it has to go. The important structural plot point that it has to be just that. We know that she was born. We know that she's having her formative years, and that's important. Now, all the different masters that she had up until she's a young teen and has this horrific incident, that has to be, it has to be condensed. So I actually did that in one number. And then we see her, there's not really in the books, you don't see that much mention of her sister, which I find to be odd, because her whole motivation for going back up and down the Northeast corridor was to find her sister.
And to get
But
the family free. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right. So I had to go back and make up these plot points where, of course, they're going out to the woods because her father is a woodsman. And there is that point where she's had her injury, and they have to, she now has to learn lumbering. So it's a nice moment to have these both sisters in there. So, it's things like that, but you have to really be careful to have a good narrative, and to be really careful that this is your sequence of events and this is supplemental material. So if you can get it in, fantastic. But if you some of that's like the colorism theme. I can't make this whole aria about a character that may or may not have existed, but I could get it into one of the songs. So, it's that's how that works.
I know Patrice Eaton, I think, is still with us. Patrice, if you're still with us, would you mind unmuting yourself and sharing with us a thought about what it was like to be part of this production at AOP and be one of the central characters of the opera? If you're still, I think you're still here.
I'm still here. I don't know if you can hear me well.
Beautifully, just fine.
It was quite an experience. It made me do a little bit of history digging myself about Harriet Tubman, because I never really knew about the Araminta part. I actually had the opportunity when Enkidu was trying to shop the opera. I did the first act down in Lower Manhattan. And so that's when I became very interested about Harriet Tubman's life. So it was a wonderful experience to watch the opera evolve, because I went from a one-act portion of the opera to a complete opera, and to the character that Enkidu wrote for me. Her importance, and especially at the end of the opera where she sends Harriet on her way back north. Her sister had died by this point, and her family had moved north. So it was quite an interesting experience, quite interesting and wonderful for me. I'm grateful, and I'm sad that we were unable to do it in Knoxville this year. It has become part of the family of my life. Music, there's certain roles that you have, and they become part of your family, and that's Caroline as part of the family. So I'm grateful. Thank you, Enkidu. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for inviting those of us who have done it from day one until now. Thank you for inviting us to come and participate today.
Thank
Patrice,
you.
I thank you for joining us today. This conversation could go on for another hour. It's so lively with so many wonderful people, but we want to be respectful of your time. And I just want to close with one thought before I turn it back to Joe to close us, is that I think one of the things you did so beautifully with this opera Nkiru is you created someone who was real. You took her off of a pedestal, and you gave us a flesh and blood character who was not something out of a history book, but was someone that we could empathize with, we could laugh with, we could cry with, and that you give her at the very end of the opera one of her iconic moments, real, or at least realized from reality. I am Moses the Liberator, you keep on going or die.
Yes.
I think is so emblematic of her life, is that she kept on going, and is in that way, if nothing else, for the hundreds of people that she brought to freedom, is reason enough to create a great opera. And we all thank you for creating this beautiful story. Words and music, I might add. And that goes back to Wagner. There are not many composers brave enough to write their own words, so bravo to you for that. So we thank you all, and I would love to turn it back to Joe to talk us out, and thank you all again for joining us today. Joe?
Certainly. I can't echo your thanks enough, Evans, to Nkiru and Jonathan and Mila and Naomi and everyone else who has contributed to this conversation. It has been such a fascinating hour. We've had some requests on the chat for a reading list, and we will put that together and email that out to everyone. Because there's so much to dive into with this, and more things to experience. We will be hosting more virtual opera chats. The next one will be on the 20th at 5 p.m. We are still working on what that opera will be, so watch your email for information about what the next virtual opera chat is. And we can't thank you enough for this hour. I really appreciate everyone being here, and please email us if you have further questions. We will be sending out a survey for you to fill out if you wouldn't mind, and in there you can send us if you have additional questions, and we can help you get them answered. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.